The Department of Homeland Security says it is targeting, quote, criminal illegal aliens in New Orleans. In the Twin Cities,
before sunrise, coordinated federal teams moved through quiet Minnesota neighborhoods, surrounding ordinary apartments and offices that had shown no sign of what was hidden inside. The operation unfolded with military precision, striking multiple locations at once, and signaling that this was not a routine fraud case, but a high-level federal action years in the making. Investigators were not chasing street criminals, but a shadow system that had quietly drained staggering sums of public money while claiming to feed children during the COVID crisis. The scale now under review reaches far beyond millions, climbing toward a figure that federal officials believe could approach $2 billion and raising questions about how such a scheme was allowed to grow unchecked. Subscribe to Military Power to follow this investigation as it moves from fraud to courtroom betrayal, political exposure, and a national security reckoning that is only beginning to surface. Federal prosecutors say the Feeding Our Future scandal began as a quiet paperwork story and then turned into a full-scale federal hunt because the scheme did not need violence to cause harm. It only required access to a pandemic program and the nerve to lie every day. In Minnesota, emergency rules meant to keep children fed during the COVID-19 pandemic created a pipeline of reimbursements. And investigators now say that pipeline was exploited by a network of fake or captured nonprofits that learned how to turn meal claims into cash. The case matters because it was built on a simple idea that can work anywhere. A form can travel faster than the truth, especially when agencies are overloaded and the public is desperate for help. Prosecutors argue that the first step was the control of nonprofits that appeared legitimate on the surface, as a nonprofit name, a friendly mission statement, and a community story can open doors that would otherwise remain closed to a private business. These groups could sponsor meal sites or partner with other organizations to provide meals to those in need. Once they were inside the program, they could file claims with the confidence of knowing that people who understood the system would not immediately verify every detail. The alleged operators did not present themselves as criminals. They presented themselves as helpers during a crisis, and that mask gave them time. Federal filings described meal counts that surged beyond what common sense would allow. Yet, those counts continued to move through the approval process. Investigators say the fraud relied on inflated numbers intended to overwhelm. Instead of claiming a few extra meals, some sites claimed thousands per day, which created a kind of pressure effect, as the numbers appeared to be an emergency response rather than a small hustle. Safari is described as serving 4,000 to 6,000 kids a day, and prosecutors used invoices and meal counts in court alongside surveillance video. The gap between paper and reality is the core of the case, as an FBI agent testified that an average of about 40 people came and went during the weeks of surveillance at that site. When a location claims thousands and a camera sees dozens, the story stops being complicated and becomes blunt. The fraud also relied on locations that could never substantiate the claims. Some meal sites allegedly had no kitchens, no freezers, no vendors, and no evidence of food movement, yet claims were filed as if those sites were feeding crowds. One location was described as an empty parking lot, which is an image that sticks because it shows how far the scheme was willing to go. Prosecutors say some sites could not legally host large groups, and in one example, a site reportedly claimed it served more children than the entire local zip code contained. These are not the kinds of mistakes that happen when someone miscounts. They are the kinds of claims made when someone believes nobody will check. To make the paperwork appear authentic, prosecutors claim the network created matching documentation. Meal count sheets, invoices, and vendor records could be produced quickly, and they could be made to appear official even when the underlying event never happened. You did not need special equipment to do this. You needed printers, templates, and a steady flow of signatures. Only a printer and a nonprofit badge, but that simplicity is precisely what made it dangerous. A simple scheme can scale, and in this case, It allegedly scaled in a way that crowded out honest providers. A key question is why the system continued to pay. The report references internal emails and staff concerns within the Minnesota Department of Education as early as 2020, with warnings that meal counts were not credible and appeared mathematically impossible. Auditors reportedly warned repeatedly, yet payments continued to flow for years. In a fast-moving crisis, agencies often prioritize speed, which can be exploited. However, prosecutors argue that the red flags here were too loud to ignore. When staff felt punished for raising alarms, the system became easier to manipulate, because silence became the safest path for people who were supposed to stop fraud. Federal investigators entered a landscape where the alleged fraud had already multiplied. The police describe an expansion from a few sites to more than 200, which shows how quickly a network can recruit when money is flowing and oversight is slow. It also references a significant enforcement action in which more than 200 law enforcement officials raided more than a dozen locations tied to feeding our future. That kind of operation is planned like a coordinated sweep because evidence can disappear, records can be moved, and witnesses can be pressured. Agents and prosecutors worked with timelines, surveillance, bank records, and phone data, and then they struck in a short window, allowing targets little time to adjust. Even if the case is argued in courtrooms, it still feels like a pursuit, because prosecutors describe investigators chasing moving pieces. The claims were passed through various agencies, and the organizations changed their names and addresses. The network allegedly utilized relationships to maintain the flow. Each approval created a new layer of cover, as it made the entire system appear normal from the outside. In a crowded bureaucracy, repeated approvals can start to look like proof, and that is the trap prosecutors say the scheme exploited. The more the state paid, the more believable the claims seemed, and the harder it became for a single internal voice to stop the machine from running. The numbers now attached to this case explain why it became national news. Court filings described more than $250 million diverted from a program intended to feed low-income children and families, and investigators and politicians have warned that the broader fraud picture in Minnesota could be much larger. Officials suggested estimates that climbed toward $1 billion and even toward $2 billion as investigators peel back connected programs and connected actors. Those figures are not only about money, but also about trust, because a program built to protect kids becomes a symbol of weakness when it can be compromised from the inside. This first phase of the story focuses on the mechanics, as before the headlines turn to names and politics, the scheme itself must be understood. It was built on fake nonprofits, inflated meal counts, locations that were unable to perform the job, and a payment system that continued to send funds despite early warnings. If you were looking at this from the outside, you might think the truth would be apparent immediately. Yet the report shows how paperwork and fear can delay action. Now, the federal government says it has enough evidence to charge dozens of people, and it is still expanding its investigation. Before we follow where the money went next, please share your thoughts in the comments. Why do you think a scheme this large could continue running for years without a hard stop at the state level? In the next section, the paper trail turns into a lifestyle trail, and prosecutors say the spending exposed what the impossible meal counts were really built to support. The feeding our future case crossed a hard line the moment a bag of cash was carried toward the front door of a federal juror, because this was no longer about stealing money from a pandemic program. It was about trying to bend the justice system itself. Federal prosecutors described this moment as the turning point that forced investigators to treat the case like a hostile operation rather than a complex fraud file. In criminal investigations, there are many ways to break the law, but very few acts trigger instant escalation, and an attempt to influence a juror sits at the top of that list. According to court filings, the bribe involved $120,000 in cash, prepared and delivered with the explicit goal of influencing a federal trial. This was not a coded message or a hidden transfer, but a direct approach that assumed fear or greed would succeed where arguments had failed. A family member of the juror alerted authorities, and that single report stopped what could have become one of the most serious breaches of judicial integrity in recent memory. For federal agents, the message was unmistakable. Someone believed the system could be bought in plain sight. From that point on, the investigation took a different tone. What had been a meticulous financial case, built around invoices, claims, and bank records, became an urgent protection mission. Federal law enforcement does not treat juror safety as an abstract concept. Any threat to that process is viewed as a threat to the rule of law. Agents moved quickly to secure evidence, isolate suspects, and ensure that no further contact could be made with anyone involved in the trial. The calm pace of a white-collar case disappeared almost overnight. This shift mirrors what happens in gang investigations when a group stops hiding and starts testing the boundaries of power. In street cases, the moment a gang targets a witness or a judge, the response changes from observation to suppression. The same logic applies here because the bribe showed a willingness to cross into direct interference. Prosecutors now argue that the fraud network had grown so confident in its reach that it believed it could shape outcomes beyond paperwork and politics. The attempt to bribe a juror reframed the entire narrative of the case. Before that moment, defense teams could argue about accounting errors, misunderstandings, or bureaucratic failures. After the bribe, those explanations lost credibility. A person does not risk prison for juror tampering unless the stakes are enormous and the evidence feels overwhelming. That single act told investigators that the defendants were no longer defending a position, they were trying to survive. Federal filings describe how the bribe attempt triggered a wave of new investigative steps. Phone records, travel logs, and personal connections that had once been peripheral suddenly became central. Agents expanded their focus to identify who knew about the plan, who helped move the money, and who believed the court could be pressured. The case grew wider, not because prosecutors wanted more charges, but because the act itself suggested a network that communicated and acted together. In gang war reporting, this is often the point where the story shifts from economics to control. Groups that profit quietly can sometimes hide behind complexity, but groups that try to control outcomes expose their structure. The juror bribery functioned the same way. It revealed hierarchy, trust, and desperation, all of which are markers investigators use to map an organization. Suddenly, the case was no longer about who filed false claims, it was about who gave orders and who followed them. The federal response reflected that change. Prosecutors began coordinating more closely with agents focused on obstruction and corruption, and the language of the case evolved. Terms like reimbursement and oversight gave way to phrases tied to judicial interference and system integrity. This was not a cosmetic shift. It signaled that the government was now prepared to pursue penalties that reflect an attack on the courts, not just misuse of funds. For the defendants, the consequences were immediate. Bail conditions were tightened, scrutiny increased, and any contact with potential witnesses was subjected to severe review. In organized crime cases, these steps are designed to prevent retaliation or coordination, and they serve the same purpose here. The court needed to ensure that the process could move forward without intimidation or manipulation, because once that trust is damaged, verdicts lose meaning. The bribe attempt also changed how the public viewed the case. A fraud story can feel distant to many people, especially when it involves programs and paperwork. An attack on a juror feels personal because it targets the system that decides guilt and innocence. Prosecutors understood that shift and framed the act as a direct challenge to justice, and the message was clear. This was no longer a story about money alone. Inside law enforcement, the incident became a reference point. Agents who work significant cases often look for signs of escalation, and this one stood out. It suggested panic and miscalculation, which usually appear when groups realize their exposure is complete. In that sense, the bribe was not a show of strength, but a signal of collapse, because it revealed fear behind the confidence that had sustained the scheme. As the investigation expanded, federal authorities began reviewing earlier interactions between defendants and the legal process. Any prior contact with witnesses, court personnel, or cooperating individuals took on new importance. The goal was not only to prove the bribe attempt, but to ensure that no similar efforts had succeeded unnoticed. In cases like this, investigators assume that a failed attempt may not have been the first idea, only the first one caught. The moment also hardened the resolve of prosecutors. In interviews and filings, they emphasized that the justice system cannot function if jurors are pressured or paid. This principle underlies every trial, from street-level violence to complex financial crimes. By crossing that line, the defendants ensured that leniency would be off the table because the system responds harshly when its core is threatened. This phase of the case illustrates why federal investigations sometimes feel slow until they suddenly accelerate. For months, the government can collect quietly, building a picture piece by piece. Then one reckless act forces everything into the open. The juror bribe did precisely that, transforming a sprawling fraud case into a full-scale confrontation between the state and those accused of trying to undermine it. And as this section closes, the focus shifts again, because once the courts themselves became a target, investigators began asking who else might be implicated and who might have benefited from the silence. In the next section, attention shifts beyond the defendants to examine political connections and money trails that extend far beyond Minnesota. After the juror bribery attempt shocked federal investigators, the focus of the case widened beyond the defendants and into the political environment that allowed the fraud network to operate for years. This shift marked a new phase of the pursuit, one that felt less like a financial audit and more like an organized crime inquiry, where investigators follow influence, protection, and silence rather than just money. Federal agencies began asking questions that reached into state offices and public institutions, because a scheme of this size could not survive without decisions that opened doors or ignored warnings. Investigators started by reviewing who approved the flow of funds as the program expanded. Emergency rules during the pandemic had lowered barriers to speed up aid, but prosecutors now argue that speed became a shield for abuse. Each approval carried a signature, a review, or a digital trail, and agents began mapping those paths to understand how impossible meal counts continued to receive authorization. This was not about proving intent overnight, but about reconstructing the chain of decisions that turned red flags into routine payments. The following line of inquiry focused on warnings that were ignored. Internal messages and audit concerns had surfaced early, according to federal filings, yet they did not stop the payments. Investigators examined whether these warnings were dismissed as an inconvenience, out of fear, or as something more deliberate. In gang cases, silence often protects power, and prosecutors applied the same lens here. They wanted to know whether the system had failed due to overload or whether certain voices were being sidelined to keep the money flowing. Political connections quickly entered the picture. Federal agents reviewed relationships between charged individuals and public figures, including campaign activities, community events, and professional ties. The goal was not to criminalize association, but to determine whether access or influence shaped oversight. In organized crime investigations, proximity can matter as much as participation, because it explains how a group operates without interference. The same logic guided this review as agents traced who stood close to the network when decisions were made. As the investigation deepened, attention moved beyond Minnesota. Financial analysts began tracking whether some of the stolen funds traveled outside the United States through informal transfer systems and overseas accounts. Legitimate families often used these channels to send money home, but they are also known for limited transparency and high risk. Federal authorities stressed that following these trails does not mean a crime has been proven abroad. It only means that the money paths require scrutiny when public funds disappear on a large scale. This is where the case crossed into national security territory. When large sums of federal aid move through systems that extremists and criminal networks have historically exploited, agencies treat the risk seriously. Investigators coordinated with specialists who monitor cross-border flows, looking for patterns rather than conclusions. The concern was not about a single transfer, but whether weak controls allowed public money to pass through channels where oversight is minimal. Throughout this phase, officials were careful to define legal boundaries. They acknowledged that no final determination had been reached regarding political wrongdoing or foreign misuse. However, the expansion of the inquiry itself signaled that the case had outgrown its original frame. What began as a Minnesota fraud file now involves federal oversight, international finance, and questions about governance under crisis conditions. The political pressure surrounding the case also increased. Lawmakers demanded explanations, and federal agencies signaled that oversight failures would be examined alongside criminal charges. This dynamic mirrors major gang takedowns, where the arrests trigger broader reviews of how territories were lost or protected. The message was clear. Accountability would not stop with those who filed false claims if evidence pointed higher. For investigators, this phase required patience. Following the influence and money across borders is a slow process, and each step must be thoroughly verified. Agents compared records, interviewed witnesses, and coordinated across jurisdictions to build a comprehensive picture that could withstand scrutiny in court. The process lacked the drama of raids, but it carried equal weight because it addressed how systems can be captured without gunfire. By this stage, the case had become more than a local scandal. It represented a test of whether emergency programs can be protected from exploitation and whether political structures respond when warned. Federal authorities emphasized that conclusions would come through evidence, not headlines, but the direction was unmistakable. Minnesota was no longer the boundary of the story. As the investigation continues, attention turns to what this exposure means for future prosecutions and reforms, and whether the pursuit will extend into broader political consequences that go beyond this single case. The story that unfolded in Minnesota did not move in a straight line. Still, it followed a transparent chain of escalation that now defines one of the most serious federal cases tied to pandemic programs in the United States. It began with COVID-19 food assistance, a system hastily built to protect children during a national emergency, and it was quietly transformed into a fraud machine that drained hundreds of millions of dollars. What initially appeared as false paperwork soon revealed a network that understood how to exploit speed, fear, and trust simultaneously. That early fraud was not violent, but it was destructive because it hollowed out a program meant to protect the most vulnerable. From there, investigators uncovered how the stolen money reshaped lives, not in the communities it was meant to serve, but among those who controlled the flow. Federal filings showed a pattern of luxury purchases that stood in sharp contrast to the children listed on meal forms. Homes, vehicles, and high-end spending became markers of success inside the network, and those choices exposed the real purpose behind the inflated claims. This shift from fake meals to visible wealth made the case easier to understand for the public, as it showed that the fraud was not accidental, but deliberate and organized. The moment that changed everything came when the justice system itself became a target. The attempt to bribe a federal juror did more than add charges. It redefined the case. That act crossed a line that federal authorities cannot ignore, because courts are the final barrier between crime and accountability. Once that barrier was challenged, the investigation expanded more rapidly and widely, and the language of the case shifted from misuse of funds to an attack on the rule of law. At that point, leniency disappeared, and escalation became inevitable. As the inquiry expanded, it reached beyond individual defendants and into the structures around them. Federal agencies began reviewing political connections, oversight failures, and decision-making under crisis conditions. Warnings that had surfaced early but were not acted upon became part of the story, raising questions about responsibility and the consequences of silence. At the same time, investigators followed money trails that appeared to extend beyond Minnesota, forcing the case into the realm of national security risk. When public funds move through poorly monitored channels, the danger is no longer theoretical, and that reality changed how Washington viewed the scandal. Looking ahead, this case shows few signs of slowing down. Federal authorities have made it clear that their focus will not stop with the defendants already charged if the evidence suggests higher or broader involvement. Political accountability may become the next frontier as investigators continue to examine who approved, who ignored, and who benefited from a system that failed under pressure. The scale of the fraud also makes broader reform likely, because emergency programs across the country now face renewed scrutiny, tighter controls, and slower approval processes designed to prevent similar abuse. This is why the Minnesota case matters far beyond the state of Minnesota. It illustrates how quickly crisis systems can be compromised, how silence can become a form of protection, and how one reckless act can expose an entire network. It also shows how federal power responds when fraud turns into a threat to justice and national trust. Subscribe to Military Power if you want transparent, grounded reporting on how these federal pursuits unfold and what they mean for the future of law enforcement and governance in the United States. And now, the final question remains open. In your view, does this case end in Minnesota, or will it pull more politicians and institutions into the spotlight as the investigation continues across America?